Levi, can you give us your definition of underrepresented founders?
Yeah, so in my case, what I'm looking at is so ethnic minorities, so Black, Latino, Native American, etc., transgender and queer founders, and women. While women are not really a minority, unfortunately, when it comes to startups, women founders are really undersupported. Last year, about 1.9% of VC dollars went to women founding teams, which is actually down from the previous year from 2.1%. And that's despite the fact that companies founded by women on average return 68% more than companies founded
That that
entirely by
that,
men.
that always drives me crazy. Like,
It's really, really nuts.
to me, like if you're how I say this correctly, if you're an investor, right, even you hate women, right, hate females, hate whatever, just for a business case, right, like you make more money when you invest in females.
Yeah,
I never understood that.
it is a little mind-boggling. I think what it comes down to, I talk a lot about institutional bias, institutional prejudice. And what I mean by that is the factors that create these underrepresentations, right? These dichotomies that aren't necessarily tied to one individual's intentional behavior, but more a system of practices. So we look at, for example, we know that if you can get more investors from these communities with these backgrounds into play, then you see more money being routed towards these underrepresented founders. But what are the barriers to those investors? Well, to be a successful VC, to raise your first fund, typically you need to show some kind of a track record of successful investments. To have a track record of successful investments, you need to have had money to deploy, right? So you have kind of this chicken and egg problem where you have people coming from these underrepresented communities, which are often less wealthy communities, right? Those folks aren't necessarily able to make those kinds of investments. They're not able to develop that kind of a track record, even though they may be perfectly capable of being a successful investor. So you see that underrepresentation happening in the investor space. And obviously, I'm grossly oversimplifying the case here. That's just one example of one of these kinds of barriers. But you have fewer investors coming from these different backgrounds. So you have fewer people with the perspective to fully appreciate where underrepresented founders are coming from. And so you have these kinds of biases becoming sort of self-perpetuating. Across the board. And I could talk about that for hours, so I'll stop there. But I do think it's a significant problem. And it has knock-on effects, not only in the fact that, investors and LPs are missing out on areas of potential, outstanding returns, but also the fact that by failing to support folks with these different backgrounds and different perspectives, we're failing to ultimately support ideas that are coming from different perspectives and different backgrounds, right? Some of those ideas might benefit some of these populations. Some of them might be just new and interesting and innovative takes on existing problems. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're failing to take full advantage of the entire spectrum of the human capacity for innovation. And I think if you look at the state of the world today in particular, what with crises from climate change to here in Seattle, homelessness, to pandemics like COVID-19, we're not in a place where we can afford to be letting any of these kinds of incredibly valuable resources to be neglecting any area of human innovation and capacity in any way. We need to be taking full advantage. If there's someone who's willing to step up to the plate with an idea and take on the incredible burden of being a founder, we need to be supporting those people. We need to be vetting those ideas without regard to the color of a person's skin or their gender or the wealth that their family has or any one of any number of other categories that really have no bearing whatsoever on their ability to start a company.
So, Levi, let me ask you this. So usually VC is all right. The money comes, San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, New York City, also like the VC hubs.
Sure.
So underrepresented founders be expanded to someone who's like, we'll say, Little Rock, Arkansas, or Mesquite, Texas, where there's
Sure.
no VC. So that'd be, regardless of race, gender, that also be expanded to the underrepresented founder.
That's a great point. Part of the problem here is making that definition, right? If you're intentionally trying to deploy capital to support underrepresented founders as a corrective to the existing paradigm, how do you draw that definition, right? And I think that's why you'll see that a lot of investors with that specific mindset and target shy away from making clear definitions of what qualifies as an underrepresented founder, which is something that I'm actually pretty supportive of. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would argue that, for example, our classic definition of an underrepresented founder does not typically include white men, for example, right? But I would argue that somebody coming, for example, from a white man coming from an extremely poor background, and let's say the hinterlands of Appalachia, probably has a substantially different perspective compared to, say, wealthy Latino man from an urban environment who happened to grow up in a more privileged environment. And that's maybe a little counterintuitive. But then at the end of the day, you have to look at it as an investor or as a philanthropist, or whatever your perspective is, and say, well, there's a limit to how deep you can dig into somebody's background and the kinds of judgments you can draw. So at some point, you have to draw a line, and it's going to be imperfect. It's going to exclude people who should be included, and it's going to include people who maybe don't quite meet your thesis. But ultimately, you're trying to capture the best picture that you can, and refine your targeting as much as possible, so that you're, to the greatest extent possible, supporting the group you're trying to support. But I will say, and especially if you are a smaller investor, I think you have the luxury of doing this. The more that you can evaluate on a case by case basis, the better the situation is going to be. Yeah.